Thank you very much for the introduction. So firstly, can everyone hear me okay? Yes. So as Rinka said, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my PhD. So the title of my PhD is Monitoring and Detecting Invasive Species in Athrobiomes with a focus on bees in the Faroe Islands. And it took a little bit of persuasion to get me to do a PhD in the first place. But my current supervisors, Rinka and Matt, came to me and they said, we want to look at bumblebees in the Faroe Islands, so you'll get to go and spend your summers in the Faroes counting bumblebees. And I was like, okay, that's pretty cool. I'll go do that. So yeah, I've been purposefully vague with my title in saying bees in the Faroe Islands because there's a little bit of my project that looks at historical honeybee introductions as well. But today I'm going to focus on the modern day bumblebees. Yeah, so you'd be forgiven for not knowing where the Faroe Islands are. A lot of people don't actually know. So they're this little place here between Scotland and Iceland. And it's an archipelago of around 18 islands and a population of 53,000 people. And just to put that into context, I think Newcastle has a population of around 300,000 people. So it's quite small. And getting to the Faroe Islands itself is interesting. So for this project, I had a lot of equipment that I needed, so I thought, why not take my car? Unfortunately, there's no ferry directly from the UK to the Faroe Islands. So I had to somehow get all the way to Denmark with my car and then get a ferry. So we drove down to Dover, across to Dunkirk, and then to Denmark. And when I say we, I mean my poor, long-suffering fiancé, who drove over 1,000 miles while I sat in the passenger seat panicking about how to go around a roundabout. So the project itself began with one of Rinka's undergrads, who was a Faroese local, and he said, I want to look at bumblebees in the Faroes. And that was interesting because, well, we didn't know that there were bumblebees in the Faroes. It's quite a cold place, quite a wet place. And you can see on the picture, it's also surrounded by a very large body of water. So that would be the North Atlantic Ocean and the Norwegian Sea. So if they are there, how did they get there? They're not a native species to the Faroes. There are, in fact, no bee species that are native there. And they only arrived in the last sort of 17, 18 years. So, yeah. So like I said, the weather is interesting. It rains probably around 300 of the 365 days and has a temperature of around 10 or 11 degrees. It's very windy. There's not much chance for it to snow, but occasionally it does. This was a photo I took last summer when I was there for 3 weeks, and it's a very good depiction of how the weather changes quite a lot. So the Faroes is very close to the Gulf Stream, which means there's a lot of wind. So if you have sun, it's likely that in about an hour's time, you're going to get rain as well. So yeah, so if you've been to previous bumblebee talks here, you probably know that's not really conducive to a good habitat for bumblebees. So yeah, it was surprising that there were bumblebees there. So I mentioned that the islands are surrounded by this huge body of water. The connections to the islands are fairly sparse. There's the odd ferry that goes in and out, and I'll talk a bit about that in a bit. The islands themselves are quite spread apart. A lot of them you can only get between using underwater tunnels. The southerlymost island, Suðuroy, is only accessible by boat. There's an island called Koltor, one of the smaller islands there. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but one of the smaller islands on the left side you can only access via helicopter. So yeah, if you can imagine this really tiny bumblebee, this wind and rain and cold weather and this inaccessibility to the different islands, and yet somehow the bumblebees have managed to not only appear on the Faroes but then spread out and establish on some of those islands as well, and it's all quite weird. So then finally I want to mention the landscape of the Faroes. As you can see from this photo, it's quite bare. There aren't many flowers you find out in the more rural areas. This photo was taken on one of the sunnier days on the roadside, and this is really a good depiction of basically the entire rural outfields of the Faroes. The islands themselves are dominated by sheep. Whilst they're totally adorable, they also decimate the floral landscape. So between towns, you find basically no floral foraging resources for them. Within the towns, you do find a lot of garden flowers, so potential for foraging, but between the towns, it's really sparse. So it's strange that the bumblebees are managing to get between these towns and are able to survive. So I'm going to take you on a little journey through the Faroe Islands and give you a brief history of when they appeared, when their first sighting was, and tell you about each of the different little species. So the first sighting of a bumblebee was in Runavík, which is the southern part of that circle, on the island of Eysturoy, and that was a Bombus lucorum, which is the white-tailed bumblebee. So this was found on the heathlands outside of Runavík, and next to Runavík you have a big fjord called Skálafjörður, and there is a lot of maritime transport that comes in and out of that fjord. A lot of goods are moved in and out. So the assumption is that the Bombus lucorum hibernated, maybe in some roots or flowers or trees, and then woke up on the Faroe Islands and found some garden flowers potentially, and fed on them, and then managed to move out into the heathlands. And we did actually visit the heathlands last summer. We only found one Bombus lucorum worker, I think it was, but it was a very cold, drizzly day. So it would be interesting to go back and see if they have managed to establish themselves there. Next we have the northern part of Streymoy, and Streymoy is the largest island of the Faroe Islands, and it's here that Bombus pretorum, or the early bumblebee, was first sighted back in 2007 in the small town of Vestmanna. And initially the early bumblebee had the most growth. It quickly established itself in Vestmanna and then moved out into the neighbouring towns. However, the numbers are dwindling, so initially it was thought that this would become the most established species on the island, but then unfortunately it hasn't been able to adapt, we assume, to the cold and the wet and the wind, so its numbers are dwindling, and in fact we haven't seen any sightings of the species in the last few years. So I plan on this summer going back there and seeing if we can find the species and see if it's still there. And then we have the island of Vea. So this is the only island with an airport. So if you were to fly to the Faroe Islands, this is where you would fly to. And the landscape is very similar to that in the photo that I showed you earlier. There's not much flora. There's a lot of sheep, a lot of grazing. However, there are two towns. I think there's 3 or 4 towns in Vea, but there are 2 main towns that have gardens. So lots of foraging opportunity, but they also have public parks where a lot of ornamental flowers have been planted. So again, a lot more opportunity. Currently, there's only one species of bumblebee recorded here, and again, that's the white-tailed bumblebee. So yeah, considering the distance between Vea and Runavík, where the first whitetail was sighted, it's quite a long distance, and the only access to Vea is via an underwater tunnel that you can drive through. So it begs the question, how did they get there? Did they hitchhike in a car, or did they fly? And then we have the southern part of Streymoy, and it's here you find the capital city of the Faroe Islands, which is Tórshavn. And this is the most densely populated part of the Faroe Islands. There's a population of around 22,000 people, and it's also the most densely populated with bumblebees. So you do actually find 3 different species of bumblebee here. You've got the whitetail again, you've also got Bombus hypnorum and hortorum, which are the garden and the tree bumblebees. And you find in Tórshavn there's a lot of gardens, which means there's a lot of foraging opportunities again. But what you also find is parks with trees. And as you can imagine from the name tree bumblebee, they like to nest in high up places such as trees. Probably what I should have mentioned is that the Faroe Islands is pretty much devoid of trees. The Vikings chopped down a lot of them in around 800 AD for agricultural purposes, and then there was a lot of sheep grazing that prevented any further growth of trees. So most trees you see now in the Faroe Islands, they're very concentrated to towns and have been imported. So yeah, in Tórshavn there's ample opportunity for both foraging and nesting. And then finally we have Suðuroy, which is the southerlymost island of the Faroe Islands, and it's here that the only individual Bombus terrestris has been confirmed. So this is the buff-tailed bumblebee, and this was confirmed using DNA analysis. It's possible that terrestris exists on the other islands, but if you can cast your minds back to previous bumblebee talks, you'll know that the terrestris and the lucorum look very similar. So they have this characteristic banding pattern of the orange, and then either a buff or a white tail. And female terrestris and lucorum are often mixed up, so it's possible that any of the lucorum sightings in other islands have been terrestris, but we just don't know yet. So I'm hoping to go back this summer, possibly take some individuals and do some more DNA analysis and see if we can figure out if they are confined to this island or if they're spread out. It's also possible that this was the only individual terrestrius on that island, and this is a queen, and no one has seen any workers or males since then. So it could have been a one-off, we're just not sure yet. So it's obviously interesting looking at new introductions of bumblebees, but why bother spending time and money studying these? Why put an entire PhD to it? And that's because, unfortunately, the bumblebees aren't native to the Faroe Islands. So whilst they're brilliant here and incredibly efficient pollinators, and they're really great for food resources for us over here, unfortunately, they have the capacity to become invasive in other places. So because of this efficient pollination, this also means a higher capability of being able to spread invasive flowers. So these are 4 of the invasive species that you find on the Faroe Islands. You've got the fuchsia, the beach rose, the salmonberry, and the daffodil. And the beach rose in particular, this pink flower up here, is one that we are particularly worried about. It's prolific in the Faroe Islands, and whilst it is really beautiful, and you do find it everywhere, it has deep reaching roots that can really establish themselves and prevent native flowers from growing as well. And when I was in the Faroe Islands, it was literally everywhere. And you found bumblebees all over it, all day, everywhere. So the Environment Agency is finding it increasingly difficult to control the spread of, so it is a worry. And as I said, they are incredibly efficient pollinators. This also means they have the potential to outcompete native insects for their foraging resources as well. So there's a lot of studies that look at how invasive bumblebees outcompete and displace native bees and bumblebees. However, as I said earlier, there are no native bees to the Faroes, so we have this opportunity to look into how the bumblebees displace other insects, other native insects, so the hoverflies and the dungflies and the butterflies and moths. So it poses the questions, do they take too much forage away from the other insects? Do they outcompete for space? Bumblebees alone have nests of around 400, so if there's lots of these nests in these towns, is this meaning that there's not much space for other insects to be able to survive? And finally, I wanted to mention nectar robbing, partly because I find it really fascinating and also because there's a lot of evidence of it on the Faroe Islands. So this is a photo of a bumblebee on Comfrey in Tórshavn, and this was taken by Marita, who her and her partner do a lot for giving us information on the bumblebees on the Faroes. But basically, nectar robbing is where bumblebees chew small holes in the bottom of flowers and remove the nectar, completely bypassing the flower's pollen system, which prevents flowers from being fertilised and being able to breed, which means their numbers dwindle quite a lot. It also means other insects waste a lot of energy visiting these flowers to take resources, not knowing that the nectar's already been taken. So I'm briefly going to go over how these things were measured. So I did a small preliminary season last year of 3 weeks, and then I'm going to be doing 3 months this summer and then 3 months next summer as well. So I'm going to start with pollinator surveys, and if you've been involved in the Northeast Bee Hunt, you'll probably know all about these. So essentially I'm going to be going to areas with and without bumblebees and measuring all of the insects along transects, and what they're interacting with flower-wise, so what they're foraging on, what they're potentially pollinating. And then I'm going to use this information to create this big plant pollinator network. And it's not been done for the Faroe Islands before, for any insects, so it's all very new and very exciting. I'll also be using environmental DNA. So if you don't know, environmental DNA is small fragments of DNA that are left behind by insects, in this case by insects that are visiting flowers. So if they're visiting there for foraging, then they'll leave behind this DNA, and then I can then take that flower and use methods to extract the DNA and figure out what insects have landed on that flower. So I can use this then as an addition to the pollinator surveys. I can also quantify the DNA that's left behind by the bumblebees. So the idea of that is to figure out how localized they are to towns. So we'll be looking at, in the center of a town, one particular flower, and then moving out of the towns, and then we'll be able to see if the bumblebees are staying within the towns or whether they're moving out of those towns. I'll also be using pollen analysis. So this is if you have honeybees, this is a marker cage. So I'll be catching the bumblebees and pushing them up to this mesh. It's all very non-invasive. It doesn't affect the bumblebee at all. And then I'll be using a jelly to take some of the pollen off the bumblebee's back, and if it's a female, from the pollen basket as well. And I can then look at this under a microscope and deduce where that bumblebee has been and what it's been foraging on. So again, this will be in addition to the surveys. And then finally, I'm also using citizen science to sort of complete the picture of where the different species are on the Faroe Islands. I'm one person, it's 18 islands. It's impossible for me to get to absolutely everywhere to figure out where everything is. So the idea is that I use locals and also tourists to take pictures and send in where they found that. So I've got a survey set up where if someone takes a photo, it then tracks where the location was of the photo and sends this to me. And I can create a map and figure out where the species are, where they've spread out to, if they're disappearing. And also it encourages locals to get involved and understand what their native insect fauna looks like, and to get excited about things such as the bumblebees. So in summary, I'll be using these 4 methods basically to build up this plant pollinator network, and then I can use this to predict what happens if bumblebees outcompete a particular insect, and then that insect is removed from the network. What happens to the other insects? What happens to the flowers? Will they disappear? And again, if an invasive flower is added into the network, will that knock something else out? So that's what these methods will be used to do. So the big question for this project then is, as bumblebees become more established on the Faroe Islands, will they become invasive? And if not negative, what other effects might they have? And I'd just like to say a big thank you to my supervisors, Rinka and Matt, for basically getting me involved in this project, giving their own insight, and Annie and Rosie as well for giving their own insights, and particularly to my Faroese connections, Jens, Child and Marita, for giving me constant support and knowledge on the Faroese bumblebees. As you can imagine, it's quite difficult researching something from a different country sometimes. And I'd also like to say thank you to my fiance for going along with my crazy travel plans and for helping endlessly with the project. So thank you for listening. Does anyone have any questions?